Cronulla Beach, Sydney, New South Wales, 11th December 2005. On this day, the world would bear witness to a series of events that would forever tarnish the reputation of Australia as being a nation tolerant of a multicultural society. Around 5,000 white Australians had gathered at Cronulla Beach that morning, a party of barbecue, beers and national pride. Within a matter of hours, this festive mood would take a sinister turn for the worst, and violence would ensue, with the whole atrocity being captured and televised live to the world. The violence perpetrated by these white Australians would soon be responded to by groups of Sydney's Western Middle Eastern male population, a turn of retaliation with many innocent Sydney-siders being caught up in the crossfire. Many of us were stunned by these turn of events and questioned how we'd reached such a dark place, and how it was that some of this nation had decided that violence was the answer to their fears and frustrations. In this oral presentation, I will consider the sociological factors that contributed to the events of the Cronulla riots. I'll also focus on racism as being the driving force behind these events. Australians would like to believe that as a nation that they can pride themselves on being highly tolerant towards other cultural groups residing in this country. But as a country, we have a long history of racism and intolerance towards other cultural groups living here. Babbage notes that until the 1970s, colonialism and institutional racism dominated the national climate, and that ethnic minorities were seen as inferior, whilst describing the situation as an old form of racism. The Australian government has a history of very restrictive measures dealing with ethnic minorities, namely the 1901 Immigration Act, which was more commonly known as the White Australian Policy. This policy, driven by deep-seated fears that Australia was under threat from invasion by Asian countries, was used to promote an Australian national identity and way of life. Not only were Asian minorities affected by these policies, but also Australia's Indigenous population suffered severe restrictions as well. The acknowledgement of the White Australia policy in the 1970s, subsequent Australian governments proceeded down a path of creating a multicultural nation in the hopes of reducing racism and prejudices against her minority cultural groups. There is some contention to the tolerant nature of multiculturalism, as whiteness is still considered to be the norm, from which other cultures are viewed as ethnic. Whereas old racism considered ethnic groups as inferior, new racism assesses ethnic communities according to their threat to the cultural integrity of Australian society. Statements like racial tolerance, cultural acceptance and multiculturalism are catch cries of modern Australian society, politics and the media. Yet these statements still drive home some form of racial and cultural separation regardless. These cultural groups remain segregated and, whilst in the same communal space, are still being held at an arm's distance. As I mentioned earlier, the Australian government has had a lengthy history of enforcing racial policies and segregation amongst its society. Additionally, Australian governments have used fear as a tactic to gain political support from their people. During the 1960s and 70s, the target of greatest threat to Australia was her Asian neighbours to the north, and towards the turn of the 20th century, that target changed to become countries within the Middle East. Within this change came a continual dialogue of anti-Muslim rhetoric, that it was those of the Muslim faith who were responsible for the atrocities that were being committed a world away. Coincidentally, the Australian government had cultivated and developed a modernised concept of nationalism to a people with the assistance from their ever-pandering media. Australia Day was revamped into a national celebration of everything that was Australian. Whilst this campaign was successful, many say that this yet was another push to strengthen the position of the Anglo-white Australians. While this political leopard had changed her behaviour, her spots had remained very much the same as before, and she was still the driving force behind the new racism campaign. This anti-Muslim rhetoric grew much stronger with the events of September the 11th, 2001. Both American and Australian governments had promised vengeance against those responsible, and that Muslim extremist groups were being targeted. Australian society was continually reminded through the political statements to the media that there was a credible threat to our own nation's safety. Although this threat was only identified by cultural and religious aspects, right-wing politicians such as Pauline Hanson had taken with this concept of fear and proceeded to further attempts to cause fear and concern amongst the Australian public. There is absolutely no doubt that there had been ongoing conflict between white Australians, socio-economic, locational and cultural groups at Cronulla Beach. As far back as the early 60s, groups from the eastern suburbs of Sydney were reported in the media carrying on like hoodlums at Cronulla Beach. Over the preceding years, terms like louts, bodgies and surfies were coined to describe these undesirable subcultural groups that were causing issues to local beachgoers and their families. During the 1990s, the groups being targeted took on a more geographical and ethnic approach, and would eventually turn on those of Middle Eastern descent. With the events of the physical clash between Cronulla lifeguards and a group of Middle Eastern males on the 4th of December 2005, the scene was set for further vilification of this ethnic group. The local media leapt on the bandwagon and started a persistent dialogue of anti-Middle Eastern rhetoric and played on the fears held by many Australians. Local Sydney radio shock jocks Ray Hadley and Alan Jones undertook an unprecedented attack against these suspected Middle Eastern gangs, with highly racist views and opinions being publicly shared over the radio waves. These anti-Middle Eastern dialogues further added to the anxieties experienced by many white Australians that the Middle Eastern Muslim threat had now reared its ugly head at the beaches of Sydney and that there was no turning back. Fear was now about to take a violent turn for the worst and would be seen by the rest of the world just days later. While I'm a firm believer that the sociological factors like racism were key players in the events leading up to Cronulla riots, I must acknowledge that there are also limitations to this view. There are also factors legally, such as the policing and investigation of events leading up to the riots, that have also been a significant contributor. Additionally, the psychological impacts of group interactions and motivations from key individuals and groups, situational factors such as weather and alcohol, that also played an essential role to what transpired on that fateful day. Whilst racism was the fuel for this fire, it took these other elements to provide the source of ignition and ensuing violence.